thanks so much for joining us on Speaking of Making Healthcare Work for You, Different Perspectives and Empowering Solutions. I'm Stephanie Fields, joined by my co-host, Dr. Apoorv Gupta, and today we welcome Dr. Besim Ogretmen, who is a professor of biochemistry, associate director for basic sciences at the Hollings Cancer Center, and associate dean for research at the College of Medicine at MUSC, the Medical University of South Carolina. We are talking to you today about your research that you've done around a specific COVID biomarker. And you have been researching lots of different things, and you do a lot of cancer research. But during COVID, you pivoted a little bit and found that researching one specific lipid or research about one specific lipid revealed that you can detect who may or may not have a symptomatic reaction or a severe symptomatic reaction to COVID-19. Can you tell us a little bit about your research, the basics of what you found?
Sure. So like you said, we were looking at whether these lipids can actually act as serologic biomarkers to identify who would be symptomatic versus who would be asymptomatic after they, become positive to COVID-19. And we found that there's one specific lipid, which is called sphingosine, is highly reduced in the symptomatic patients. This was actually almost 99%, 98, 99% of the patients have shown reduction of this lipid in their serum, and they are the symptomatic patients.
And they actually, this is something that you said you think you have to do more research, but you think is inherently low levels for them. It's not something that gets reduced whenever they get COVID-19. It's something that you should be able to test. So you said that there's multiple applications that originally you were thinking of whenever vaccines were not widely available. You thought that this might be something that you could use to test people to determine if they had this baseline low level lipid level. And if they did, then prioritize those people for vaccination because they are more likely to have a symptomatic response.
That's right. So initially, our idea was to understand, why some people show symptoms and while some don't, although, both populations become positive for antibody. So they are exposed to the virus, but some are symptomatic and some asymptomatic. And we wanted to understand if there are some biomarkers that can actually identify and help us identify these. And so I guess the implications are interesting because, like you said, if there are limited amounts of vaccines or other treatment options, so you want to identify who would be benefit most. So who would be the more vulnerable in population? So this low level of lipids might be able to tell us, who should be getting the first line of treatments.
Dr. Ogretmen, I find that really interesting that you identified this biomarker. As you're explaining what your thought process is, it feels like you could apply this at the stage of prevention, which is I think how you wanted to use it, but then you could also apply it potentially to the stage of treatment. Maybe once the person is infected and they become symptomatic, now you want to know who's more likely to get sick. You could also potentially, you were telling us earlier, use it to identify who are the people that should maybe get the next round of vaccine, the boosters. So could you help us understand for our audience particularly, how does a scientist go through that process of figuring out how a best biomarker may be most helpful?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And there are many markers that have been identified as we move along in similar studies. So our idea was to use our expertise at MUSC. So we have a world-class lipidomics center where we can measure lipids in serum and other specimens. And so we thought, let's use our expertise and see if these lipids which are also identified as biomarkers in other diseases like cardiovascular disease and cancer. So basically, we were actually just trying to help the field and see whether we can contribute to have some identification of some of these lipids as potential biomarkers. So it was purely scientific and collaborative work at MUSC. So we used many different expertise and so that we can contribute to the field. And we are hoping that this will be the initial part and we can, move forward to identify, whether this is inherited problem in some patients, so they become more vulnerable, or their responses to the viral infection becomes less active, so that these lipids are much lower during this response to viral infection. So these are the questions that we are trying to answer to understand what's going on in some people, like I said, becoming more severely ill, and the ones that don't have any symptoms.
A follow-up question that comes to my mind on that basis is there something like a lipid profile similar to a genomic profile? And many people are now getting their genomic profile done. Should we be also thinking about getting a lipid profile done? Do they kind of go hand in hand? Obviously, the genes lead to the encoding of the proteins, but where does this go? And maybe if I could throw a second question in there as well, is the field of personalized medicine that ultimately also not only just about the genes, but also ultimately about the proteins? Could you comment on both of those, please?
Yeah, great question. As you know, the omics, genomics, and proteomics have been, very important for personalized medicine and detection of biomarkers. So now the lipidomics, which measure lipids in serum and other tissues, it became very important biomarker detection system. And we believe that some of these lipids and lipidomics might become important for early detection of some of the diseases, and also, like you said, personalized medicine becomes important here. And some people actually have reduced lipids and some have higher lipids. So based on those kind of genomics and lipidomics, maybe work together to identify who would be vulnerable, more vulnerable, more than others, And so, yeah, you are actually right. And we believe that the lipids might also be very important to detect for these kind of early detections as well as, therapeutics.
The specific lipid that you're talking about, and I'll probably say this wrong because I don't know what it is, but sphingosine. What is that lipid typically used for? And is that something, because so many things in medicine, your cholesterol, your blood pressure, you can control through diet, exercise, other types of things. Is there anything that people can do to boost that specific lipid?
Yeah, that's a great question. Just like cholesterol, this is a class of lipid, sphingolipid it's called. And the one of the molecules is called sphingosine. And so that's what we found, this particular lipid. And there are, some advances in the lipidomics field where lipid analogs can be used as drugs or therapeutic agents. So for example, this lipid, which is low in, symptomatic patients, we are trying to understand whether that can be used as some sort of therapeutic agent to prevent infection. So these lipid analogs can be used to boost that lipid back to normal levels. And, there are some diet that can contain some of these lipids. Although the sphingolipids are not very major in diet, there might be some dietary remedies that can boost this lipid. And actually, there are some chemopreventive dietary compounds that are known to induce these sphingolipids. But, I'm not so familiar with the preventive dietary conditions where this particular lipid can be selectively induced.
With the research that you did, you found, people with higher levels of this had asymptomatic cases, and people with lower levels had symptomatic cases. But the people who had the higher levels, are theirs within the normal range of that lipid, or are they on the high range of that lipid?
Yeah, great question. We found that there was a slight increase in their levels compared to negative, antibody negative population. So they were actually getting much better response once they were infected with the virus. So it could be something, more stress response kind of thing. So some people are actually respond much better to viral infection by increasing this lipid, which studies show that can be protective of the actual infection to the lungs.
That's fascinating, Dr. Ogretmen. I never realized how interesting I would find this whole subject. So on the idea of what you said, lipidomics, I'm really curious to know, in general, beyond the biomarker sphingosine that you've identified, how advanced is the field in terms of its readiness to come to a CVS near you? Are there already examples of places that are using lipid biomarkers in real time to help detect conditions? Do you already have examples of therapeutic agents you're starting to use in this way, or are we still a few years out from that scenario?
Yeah, great question. So first, for the biomarker field, some of these lipids, I don't know if I mentioned, but they are used for cardiovascular disease predictions. So some of my colleagues think that these sphingolipids actually are almost as good as cholesterol for predicting cardiovascular diseases. And in some cancer as well, so we are working with some of our patients to see whether these lipids also be biomarkers to look at response to the chemotherapy and some other therapeutic agents in cancer settings. So that was about the biomarkers and predictive qualities of these lipids. But also there are some therapeutic aspects of these lipids. Like I said, there are some lipid analog drugs. So there is, for example, one drug that has been approved for FDA for multiple sclerosis. So that's a lipid analog drug, that sphingolipid analog drug. And we have one lipid enzyme inhibitor that is in the phase 2 clinical trials at Hollins Cancer Center for prostate cancer patients. And then I know in the field, there are lipid analog drugs that are also in phase 1 or phase 2 clinical trials for solid cancer treatments.
Oh, fascinating. So you think within the next 5 years, we're going to see a lot more of this type of, therapeutics, vaccines, preventative measures. You think it's going to take off in the next 5 years?
Yes, we think so. Again, compared to proteins, the lipids have been in the back burner for a long time. And now in the past 15 years or so, it became very important, especially after FDA approved this lipid analog drug for multiple sclerosis. It showed that this pathway can be druggable in patients in a safe manner. So after that, we have many tools to study this metabolic pathway, and so now more therapeutic companies and including some of our biotech spin-off companies trying to use some of these mechanistic studies to come up with new drugs and new therapies. And we are hoping that, in the next 5 years, there will be more lipid analogs drugs in the clinic.
It's funny because whenever you describe this, like the lipid research is about to have its moment. It sounds like how people describe things as like an overnight success. Meanwhile, these people have been working for a year, like a band working or for 10 years in the clubs before they make it big. And I
That's
feel like
right.
that's how you're describing the lipid research. Like you've been in the lab for several decades, working
right.
hard, and now finally it's about to pay off. But I mean, really, you just don't hear until now, you don't hear about lipid research and all the different ways that can be applied and really make a huge difference in medicine. But the work that you're doing, especially with cancer patients too, which is something that just unfortunately continues to grow in the population, it just has to be amazing to you and so personally fulfilling to be able to see that you can change the lives of people through the work that you're doing. What gives you that passion to do that every day?
It's amazing, in the cancer center, especially, we use the same elevators with our patients and their families. And so our job is really to help anybody that we could based on our research and our expertise. And I always tell my students, when you take the elevator, when you see the patients and their families, just to remember that, what you do in the lab makes a difference in their lives. So that's the idea, how can we use our expertise and our day-to-day experiments to have some implications to touch somebody and their families, as you know, it's a very severe disease and, many different and difficult outcomes. And so, but, we are hopeful that the cancer research and other research, and one thing that this COVID, I think, taught us as a nation and as people, research is so important to come up with, who's going to be more vulnerable and what kind of treatment options that we will have for people. I think in population now, I think the research became much more important in their minds, that when you are exposed to something that nobody knew what it was and how to fight it, everybody looked up to the researchers and to get some guidance to what to do, And so I think one thing that positive that came out of this, hopefully, is the importance of research that was understood in the population more.
I really appreciate your insights here. And I think that the thing, as Stephanie's saying, you know probably lots of people that have heard of lipidomics. Many of us have never really heard of it. And our audience, I think, is going to think, wow, I never realized that there was this field out there. You're toiling away for decades and just working in the background until the opportunity arises. As you're saying, the COVID pandemic comes about, and now suddenly people hopefully are realizing more about epidemiology and about vaccines and about hopefully lipidomics as well. So the question I have is, as if you weren't busy enough throughout all of this, the pandemic hits, you're already doing so much research, and yet you're thinking very creatively and openly and collaboratively, and you decide that I'm working on something that might be able to help in this area. I find that just entirely fascinating, because it's so easy to just think that you're such a technical expert in what you do. You're just going to continue to stay heads down and focus on that. Can you help us understand, get inside your brain a little bit as to what allows for someone like yourselves to really think creatively and openly and collaboratively and want to be able to walk down the hall and talk with your colleagues about how you might be able to do something different to help with the pandemic?
Yeah, so that's a great point, and that's why we are scientists. Our minds think always, how can we help people and what can we do to advance the field. And again, everything was shut down during COVID, and our labs were kind of in the minimal, productive situation. And so we were always talking with my colleagues here about, what can we do? Because every day we were getting all these death numbers from COVID, and, it was just, unbelievable situation. And we always think, how can we actually use our expertise to help the situation at the moment? We could have easily said, well, let's just wait and see what happens and, and do our business as usual. But, we selected, okay, let's do something that we can help maybe. We didn't know what the results were going to be. And we are, hopeful that this might be actually helpful for advancing our understanding of how some people become more vulnerable and how can we help at the end,
I love that. It takes so much courage, and also I don't even have the right word for it, but it's really, courage, and then just that extra oomph to push through, because as Apoorv said, during COVID, everybody, I think, was stretched to their max, whether it was mentally trying to deal with everything, or people like you who are dealing with actual, situations and trying to do this research to make a difference. And it takes a lot to do all of that. And it's something that we've heard over and over and over, both in our interviews with everybody at MUSC and also with all of the people. Again, our tagline is different perspectives, empowering solutions. And the people who were truly out there making change seem to have this common thread of both collaboration, but also creative empowerment, and they don't seem to sense the limitations on them. And you seem that way. So what is it about you and your team that allows you to go in and think not only like, okay, we normally do cancer research and we're doing this and that's super important, and you really don't have a good reason to stray away from that because it's such a huge problem, but somehow you both felt empowered that you could pivot and do something else like that you were, and your team's all on board for it, and the interest and excitement around it. So what is it about that team culture or your environment that's allowing you and your team to think that way and do these big things?
Yeah, I think I should mention also that, this is not only our collaboration, but all the work that has been done earlier in COVID-19, both in patients and research. Because, earlier studies show that there is a lot of cytokine storm and, inflammation-related complications in COVID-19 symptoms. And we knew from the literature that these lipids play a lot of roles in this inflammation and the cytokine production. So it didn't just, fell out of the blue, but we knew the literature both in the lipid field as well as in the new upcoming results from the COVID-19 related research, from all over the world, actually. And so, science is a cumulative work. So somebody somewhere else in the whole world, publishes something, and that triggers something in our brain to say and make connections between what we know from our field and what has been published in other fields, in this case in COVID-19. So that, allows you to, advance the field based on the knowledge that we gather as a collective scientific community. And so that's so important. I like to highlight knowing the literature as well as knowing not only your field, but, other fields as much as possible, can allow you to make those links between your field and others that maybe you are not as an expert, but you can actually make some connections between these fields.
Thank you so much. This was a fascinating conversation. I learned so much about a field I knew nothing about. And this was really amazing. I love what you're doing, and it sounds like it's really going to make a huge difference in the future.
Hopefully, yes, that's what the idea is.
Thank you for giving us a glimpse into the scientific process as well. It's a unique opportunity for both of us and for our audience. So thank you so much, for Dr. Ogretmen, for everything you're doing.
Sure. Thank you for talking to me.
Thank you all for watching. Bye-bye.
Bye.